In the age of information, some events have such an impact that they transcend the headlines and find their way into the visual narrative of documentaries. Netflix, as a global platform, has captured some of the most astonishing and at the same time disturbing stories of our time, providing millions of viewers a window into the events that have left the world breathless. So in this compilation, we are going to explore and analyze news, crimes, and events that not only astonished everyone, but have also been immortalized in documentaries on Netflix. There was a man very loved by the people in Great Britain. Many grew up with him, watching his shows, listening to him on the radio, and rubbing shoulders with big celebrities. He was, let's say, too good to be true. He was like a magical being who could grant any wish. If you wanted to fly, he made it possible. Did you want to meet one of your idols? He would take you by the hand and introduce you to them. All of this was seen by more than 1 million viewers, but behind all of this, there was a perverse reality. Today, I'm going to tell you about the case of Jimmy Savile, a very famous presenter who had all of England in the palm of his hand for his charity work and his ease of talking to people. But what they didn't know was that behind that charismatic smile was a lover of the little ones. Because a year after his death, several abuse allegations came to light. Jimmy Savile's childhood was like any other. He was born on October 31st, 1926 in Leeds, England. His parents were Vincent Savile and Agnes Monica Savile, who made a great effort to support 7 children. His father worked in a betting house, while his mother provided lodging to people for free because she loved to help. She provided them with clothes, food, and beds so they could have a comfortable stay. The boy just saw how his mother did it without receiving anything in return. Sometimes she had money and at other times she struggled, but she never stopped helping. He was always surrounded by many people. He had to live with strangers because, being the youngest in the family, he had to accompany his mother to work. Thanks to this, from a young age, he knew how to deal with people and win their affection. He was very talkative and generated a lot of trust in adults. At the age of 2, he unfortunately fell seriously ill with pneumonia. The doctors no longer had any hope. They even suggested to his relatives that they start saving for the funeral and begin the paperwork for the death certificates. The parents never gave up on him and decided to take care of him at home instead. And so he improved remarkably. His mom said that thanks to her praying every day in front of the little one, the miracle happened. He was always described as a cheerful person. He motivated those around him and helped in any way he could. One of his first jobs was as a coal miner. His colleagues also said he was a very jocular person and that he made the work hours less heavy with his jokes. Everyone around him encouraged him to find a career where he could unleash all his potential. So he quit the mine and started with a small job in a dance hall directing people. He was so good that people only went at times when Jimmy was dancing. He started to become known then, and by the year 58, he jumped to fame as a Radio Luxembourg presenter and hosting a program called Teen and 20 Disc Club. He was in high demand. Thanks to him joining the program, the ratings began to rise and rise even more. There was a lot of congestion at the exit of the radio station building, and everyone wanted to have a radio bracelet. Thanks to all the support he received, he was promoted and given his own show on British Broadcasting Corporation Radio called Sabile's Travels. This was broadcast every Sunday from very early on and consisted of traveling all over England to talk face-to-face with fans and get to know them better. Jimmy knew how to talk to them and let them know they were being heard. He did this to gain more fans because he knew how to reach the heart of each of the interviewees. He was very likable and everyone adored him for his charm. His main audience were young people and teenagers, so in the late 60s, he was hired as the host of Speakeasy, where he interviewed people from 15 to 25 years old. One of his most stable jobs was as a presenter on the Old Record Club program. His career was increasingly on the rise. He was very sought after by people, and there was not a soul in the United Kingdom who did not know the name of Jimmy. Even at the peak, he always took care of his parents. His mother went to live with him when his father passed away. After his father's death, he became very close to his mother, even though she never congratulated him or showed any sign of pride. Jimmy worked hard to keep her happy in his mansion. The man even claimed that his mother never watched an episode of his show because she didn't find what he did interesting and believed that he only helped people for his own benefit. Well, the mother probably knew the background of all this. What? I'm going to tell you this right now. This never bothered him. Jimmy was still himself. He entertained people and reportedly took care of his mother upon returning home. The woman would end up passing away in the year 73. Jimmy tried to smile for the cameras because he didn't want them to know he was devastated. Later, he admitted he wanted to keep his mother's body. He had it in an open casket, but he was only with it for 5 days. He said she looked wonderful, so vulnerable and lifeless. He also mentioned that the days he had his deceased mother's body were the best days of his life. It is not known for certain what he did with it in the time he had it in his care. It is only believed that he had to hand it over and give it a burial to avoid any scandal. When he came out to speak about this event, he only spoke wonders of her, while when asked about his father, the man became serious and preferred not to answer. 2 years later, he created a program called Jimmy Fix It, or Jimmy Fixes Everything. He founded this because he said he received many letters from fans asking for help. By then, he was very well known for the charity work he did. He participated in sports marathon events to raise funds, volunteered in hospitals, and always contributed from his own pocket to help various institutions. Once he announced the theme of the show and why he was going to do it, more than 9,000 letters arrived at his residence. He and his team were in charge of reading everything to select the most interesting cases. The people who were granted their wish were invited to the show. They were typically girls aged 8 to 15. Jimmy called himself Dr. Magic. He always read the letters out loud, introduced the author, and then gave them the surprise they were so eagerly waiting for. And at the end of the episode, he would give them a medal that said, "Jim fix it for me," or "Jim fixed it for me." The most notable wishes were when someone's dream of meeting their idols was fulfilled. In fact, a young man named Dom Lawson wanted to be a technician for a day for the band Iron Maiden. This was so incredible that at the end of the day, the man got a job as a technician for several bands. Jimmy had so much power in the industry that he was very well known by bands like the Beatles. He had a strong connection with this group and even went on several tours with them. Paul McCartney, in fact, in an interview stated that the boys and he found his behavior a bit strange. Sometimes he made somewhat risque jokes. On one occasion, he didn't let them into his house, and when they insisted in a very angry tone, he denied them entry again as if he was hiding something. That's what Paul said. He was an exemplary man. He even received gold medals from the Queen, also obtained his honorary doctorate in law, and even the Pope recognized him as a gentle person by granting him a Vatican noble title naming him Sir. He rubbed shoulders with Prince Charles and Lady Di. He was so important in royalty that by royal order, Prince Philip asked him for advice. Similarly, he inaugurated several hospitals, medical centers, orphanages, and hospices for low-income people. Sometimes he would stay overnight with them. The media praised him for being so altruistic and getting 100% involved in his projects. Finally, Jimmy lost his life in October of 2011 due to pneumonia.
Many described that he passed away very peacefully one night while he was sleeping.
When this was announced, the entire continent fell silent due to such tragic news. Prince Charles issued a statement saying the Prince and the Duchess are saddened to learn of the death of Jimmy Savile, and their thoughts are with his family at this time. All the streets were closed. The coffin was painted gold and placed at a 45-degree angle so he could see the sea one last time. All of this was very moving. People came to give him flowers and everyone paid him tributes. But it wasn't a sad event for everyone. In fact, his death was a great liberation for more than 500 people. Many people began to speak, to declare and shout what this much idolized person really was. They had to keep quiet for more than 50 years about what Jimmy was doing for fear of him doing something terrible. Giving so much power to one man could be a catastrophic idea, and that's exactly what happened with him. Many witnesses came forward to say that if anyone questioned anything about this character, they could be fired, sued, or even disappeared. Many looked at their television screen and only saw the man who caused them nightmares at night. 2 years before his death, there were 3 complaints against that presenter, but these were silenced since at that time Jimmy was a national treasure. He got away with it. They didn't want scandals around him, but the strangest thing was that this man didn't even watch his words or do anything to keep his image clean, because in each of his shows, there were signs of his perversion. If someone were to broadcast the episodes where he hosted today, they would see the warnings for everything Jimmy said. Everyone laughed at the time at what he commented because they believed he was a good man, but the reality came to light a year after his death. When they found out about the complaints against this so-called national treasure, more and more began to emerge until they reached a number of over 500 victims. Mo Peter Watt, one of the victims of this sick man, declared that he actually had the whole public in his hands because he was an expert in manipulation. He had this guise of being a man who helped people so that they would silence the truths or the real atrocities he committed. This man, Peter, testified that he cunningly built his entire life around gaining access to vulnerable children to carry out his abuses. He hid in plain sight behind a halo of eccentricity, deceiving those who challenged him. And this was proven as in hospices, hospitals, orphanages, and even morgues. He abused the little ones, apart from sick people and even lifeless bodies. One of his first brushes with the police was when he was leaving a nightclub where he ran into 2 young people who wanted a photo. Jimmy, after giving them what they asked for, began to overstep a bit with them. The girls told him that they had to go home while the men's friends watched how they became very uncomfortable, more and more uncomfortable with the groping of this presenter. One of them began to scream for help from the authorities, who instead the police arrived where they were, but they didn't do much or didn't do anything since Jimmy paid them and they just left telling him to leave them alone or he could get involved in some scandal. Everyone knew that Jimmy had a big problem with alcohol, but this was not talked about as much. It was just a secret that was whispered. But his acquaintances knew perfectly well how he behaved after several drinks. Even at a party with the Beatles, they met some 17-year-old girls. You later stated that they left because they didn't want to get involved with underage people and left Jimmy alone with these women. All of this was revealed in the year 2011 in a documentary narrating all the accusations against him. Many victims were asking for justice, something that the authorities could no longer do because the abuser was already deceased. He was accused of at least 214 crimes, 73 of them were minors. As I had said before, most of the children who were housed in his foundations were violated. The medical staff was even included in the abuse history. One of the most notorious accusation stories was that of a pair of little ones who wanted to meet their idol. A woman went to the show with her 2 nephews while they were watching the show, and Jimmy dressed as a puppy. The children were very excited to be so close to their favorite character. As a charitable act, the host, still in character, told one of his guards to bring the 2 children over. The children introduced themselves and told him that they had traveled from Scotland with their aunt to be in the studios and meet him. The man, in turn, was moved by what they had done, offered them a private talk, and he asked their guardian for permission to take them to his dressing room. This was obviously a colossal mistake by the mother. There, the girl and the boy ate all the sweets that were there. They had a chat with Jimmy and left 15 minutes later. But 20 years later, that little girl who was able to enter the room with Savile revealed that what actually happened behind that door was terrifying. She narrated that Jimmy, without taking off his dog suit, began to touch them. The boy was more innocent than her, that referring to the girl, so he proceeded first with him to remove all his little clothes. He caressed him everywhere while the infant watched as the mascot caressed his brother. Suddenly, the innocent one began to scream in pain. Jimmy told him to be quiet. There was going to be no surprise for the two of them. The woman remembered that scene perfectly. The blood that was on the couch and the tears that were coming out of her companion. After that scene, he let them go. He didn't touch the girl. He just told them it was a secret they had to keep. When the caregiver asked them what they had done, they simply said they had eaten cookies. The young girl now says she was very scared to confess this because she thought it was all her fault for insisting on going to see him, for not helping her little brother, and moreover, for letting them be alone. One of the people who helped reveal the true face of the presenter was Marion Jones.
He says he was in contact with Jimmy a lot throughout his childhood.
He spent his weekends at Duncroft School, as his caregiver was the director there. This institution was responsible for helping young people in difficulty, such as with illegal substances, in poverty, and also assisted those who were homeless. The man saw how Jimmy always arrived and took a few girls with him. He found this strange, but when he asked, no one would answer. Sometime later, he became a journalist and worked for the British Broadcasting Corporation. After the funeral of the English icon, he wanted to answer all his questions himself by trying to investigate what had happened to all those young people who were taken from the institution. After a thorough investigation, he found documents, messages, and websites detailing the abuses suffered by these individuals' victims. There were several exchanges of comments where they testified that Jimmy had touched them, abused them, and even hit them. This had become a large chain of statements exposing the most famous presenter in the United Kingdom. Along with Liz McKean, Jones began the documentary project on Jimmy to expose all the atrocities he committed in life. Everyone was shocked when the true face of this man was revealed, as he was still considered an icon, and they couldn't believe everything he had done in life. Little by little, people stopped being afraid. They felt the support of several television stations, police and judges who needed statements. Thanks to this, there were more complaints. Every time this character was talked about, people felt disgusted
and repulsion,
thinking that at some point they supported him. The same citizens removed several commemorative plaques. His cemetery headstone was vandalized and also stolen. One of the most disturbing things was when they analyzed the programs. As I had already told you before, Jimmy didn't take very good care of his words or his image. Sometimes he made double entendre jokes with a touch of perversity. And when they investigated him again, they realized that even on camera, Jimmy was groping the victims, talking about wanting to hit the lead singer of the Rolling Stones. Sometimes he asked for close-ups of the breasts, legs, and buttocks of his colleagues, even being a children's program. They also talked about his mother's death and the possible intimacy he may have had with the lifeless body. No one ever found out why he wanted to keep his mom's body, or why he had stated that he had felt so much peace and joy when he had her lifeless body at his home. This theory came about when several paramedics also confessed that when Jimmy went to the psychiatric hospital, several people who died there were taken out by professionals, along with this man who sometimes made comments about the deceased people. For example, he mentioned that the muscles were in good condition, that their eyes were beautiful, that their death was a waste since they still looked very good and preserved, and he wished to take them home. These words at the time, I don't know how, but they didn't impress anyone because they knew what he was like and how funny he was. One of the employees also remembered later that Jimmy boasted that he had taken corpses to please himself and take pictures of them in compromising positions. Jimmy's taste for minors was no secret. In fact, several celebrities before his death declared the times they saw him walking with 13 to 14-year-old girls. He just said they were friends he was walking with, but with everything that came to light, it's no longer known what was real and what wasn't, which I believe everything was real or everything was abuse. Especially because the network he worked for covered up his misdeeds very well. It's unknown to what extent the British Broadcasting Corporation knew about all the accusations against their star, which, well, this is just my opinion, they were probably quite well informed. But then again, money is always the priority for many people or for these types of networks. Everyone only saw the tip of the iceberg of the smiling man with platinum hair who granted wishes. Unfortunately, it took them a long time to realize that he was actually a depraved monster who used all his charity work so that no one would suspect sick children, vulnerable people, and even corpses were exposed to the most maniacal and manipulative person of all time, and there was never justice for them, or perhaps there was divine justice. The life of the well-known Jeffrey Dahmer has been studied by many psychologists and specialists, but very few know the story of his childhood and also that of his mother Joyce. She suffered from a mental illness while raising her son and could never overcome the guilt of having created a real monster once the whole world knew about his horrific crimes. In today's video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the tragic childhood of one of the most recognized serial killers in the United States, but a little more focused on the life he had with his mother. When society tried to find a reason for the numerous crimes of the Milwaukee cannibal, who ended up with at least 17 men and teenagers from 1978 to 91, the criminologists quickly focused their attention on the mother, Joyce Dahmer. The questions that stood out were, did she create such a violent environment that her son ended up becoming a monster? Was there something Joyce could have done differently to avoid this outcome? Is there a possibility that her addictions played a major role in creating Jeffrey? Jeffrey's parents were Lionel Dahmer and Joyce Flynn, a woman born on February 7, 1936 in Columbus, Wisconsin. And although there are no concrete data on the date she married him, one thing that is known for certain is that their first child, born on May 21, 1960, would become one of the most sought after and hated men in the entire nation. Classifying the Dahmers as the typical American family would be a quite severe mistake. According to Lionel's own memoirs, the family unit didn't even enjoy being happy or belonging to the community in which they lived. Lionel, for his part, was busy most of the time with his doctoral studies, so he spent little time at home. And the mother, even though she was at home, was far from being an exemplary figure. The testimonies provided by the father revealed that she was taking medication even while she was pregnant, and that once the 9 months were over, her mental state was unstable and not fit to be responsible for a child. In the book that the head of the family wrote, there is a quote that reveals the mother's concern and symptoms. And it said, "As a scientist, I wonder about the potential for evil, whether it resides in the blood of some of us, and whether it is plausible that it can be transferred to our children at the time of birth." He also states that his now ex-wife was a hypochondriac and suffered from episodes of depression and spent too much time in bed. In addition, on many occasions, she was afraid to touch her own son Jeffrey for fear of contracting some germ or disease. But Joyce Dahmer had a series of opinions that differed from her ex-husband's story. In 1993, she gave an interview to Microsoft National Broadcasting Company where she gave a different version of everything that happened during those years. Despite the father's claims that their son was a shy and withdrawn child, the mother mentioned that throughout his childhood, there were no symptoms or signs of what Jeffrey would become. She also said that after his sentence, she reviewed his entire life thousands of times looking for the mistakes she could have made when raising him. The truth is that both of them were somewhat right in their stories. That blonde boy with blue eyes, a model student and well-mannered, was quite lively and outgoing, and above all, he stood out for being very curious, which led him to experiment with things and take them to an extreme. One of the first signs that this criminal germ would grow to lead him to commit the worst crimes came in the form of animal abuse from an early age, as is usually the case with murderers. He hunted them, made them suffer, and then dissected them to tinker with their intestines and bones. His father explained that he was investigating what animals were like inside while he was developing his sexuality, but he never thought that this strange behavior would go any further. He simply believed it was a curiosity, as I tell you, typical of some children. I don't know how typical it is to play with dead animals, but well. And it was this that made his life change in relation to others. From then on, he became a shy boy without social relationships, and it can be said that he was strange. His father remembered this in his memoirs. It was around these times that his fascination with death became like a bigger obsession. It all happened in a biology class where, after dissecting a piglet at 16 years old, he discovered what would be his life's mission and the feeling of taking the life of something or someone. Also, around this time, his sexuality was defined and he knew that he was actually homosexual. With all these new experiences, they were joined by his problems with alcohol and substances, a cocktail of emotions and problems that would lead him to commit his first major crime in June of '78. During these years of excesses, fantasies, and fatalities, Jeffrey did his thing with total impunity and in the worst possible way. The same man said on television cameras once he was arrested that one thing led to another. Each time I had to do stranger things to satisfy my instincts. In this way, I felt they were a permanent part of me. Also, I was curious to know what it would be like. I felt they were going to become a part of me. Eating them gave me sexual pleasure. As I tell you, these were the words of Dahmer from Jeffrey a few months before his arrest, and after ending the life of a teenager named Konorak, no one ever suspected him as he was always affectionate, attentive, and even pleasant. He attended family celebrations, conversed enthusiastically, and enjoyed the company of his father and grandmother, with whom he lived for a while. But in reality, that false mask and charisma concealed 13 crimes that would add up to 17 in total in the next 60 days. The city of Milwaukee witnessed a series of strange disappearances and crimes never seen before, but everything would come to an end in July of '91, when one of his victims would manage to escape. 31-year-old Tracy Edwards managed to escape from the clutches of this individual and his apartment of death. That day, he ran out of the house where he was captive to a patrol car and told them that a sick individual had poisoned him. During the search, the officers encountered a nightmare in the form of horror. In the house, they found human remains in the freezer, a head in the refrigerator, a 200-liter drum with more than 2 torsos at the bottom submerged in acid, and more than 80 photographs of the victims torn to pieces. They had just hunted down one of the most violent, ruthless individuals who would be remembered by everyone on the day of his trial, now known as the Milwaukee Butcher. He became famous all over the globe, from t-shirts, comics, paintings with his face, posters, and even songs dedicated to this individual, which would keep the image of Dahmer alive for many years. The fervor of a sector of people who saw him as an idol immortalized his atrocious acts and elevated him as if he were some kind of hero. The next 3 weeks, the court heard how Jeffrey recounted the aberrations he committed with his multiple victims. They witnessed the numerous pieces of evidence that the investigators brought forward and how the alleged culprit claimed to be suffering from madness, but a strategy that proved useless. The jury voted 10-2 that the defendant was legally sane to face prison. On February 15th of the year 92, the court sentenced him to 957 years in prison in Wisconsin. And as if that weren't enough, which is many years, in May of that same year, he received a second life sentence in Ohio. His stay in jail was filled with interviews and television cameras that wanted to know the motives and private life of the sentenced. Unfortunately, or well, I don't know how you see it, perhaps fortunately, his stay there was short. Only 2 years later, the man who for so long had become the predator was finally prey. Assigned with Christopher Scarver, an individual diagnosed with schizophrenia on cleaning duties, he would be the one to take his life by using a gym weight bar to brutally beat him. The irony here is that this is how Jeffrey committed his first crime, beating Stephen Hicks with a weight. The Milwaukee butcher died shortly after on the way to the hospital due to severe head injuries. On November 28th of 94, at the age of 34 years, he had passed away. What's curious is that after Scarver gave his testimony, he mentioned that Dahmer agreed to accept his fate, as after the first blow, he put up no resistance. On the other hand, his parents, especially his mother, could never live with the pain and guilt of everything their son had done and suffered. Joyce was interviewed sometime later and said the following: "I still love my son. I never stopped loving him. He was a beautiful boy and a phenomenal son. He was always someone loved." After the terrible news of their son's death, the parents entered into a legal dispute. The mother wanted Jeffrey's brain to be examined, to be able to determine some hereditary biological factor that would shed light on his terrible crimes. Perhaps with the certainty that here he could rest or get a bit of mental peace by feeling guilty every day. Lionel, who ended up winning the legal battle, ordered that his son be cremated. Whether or not it was their parents' fault, Joyce felt such great remorse that she tried to take her own life on several occasions. A few months after her son, her monster, was killed, she decided to open all the stove valves and wait to die from poisoning. A note in the writing said, "It's been a lonely life, especially today. Please dispose of my body. I love my children, Jeffrey and David." But against all odds, he survived this and several future attempts until his wish finally came true in a tragic way. Tragic. When Joyce died of breast cancer in the year 2000 at the age of 64, her friends and family recounted in interviews that the only impediment and burden that afflicted her was guilt. One of Jeffrey's lawyers, named Gerald Boyd, commented that despite the Milwaukee butcher's testimonies to absolve his parents of responsibility, his mother carried the idea that she was a monster for bringing into the world a person who had done so much harm, and this had led her to feel forgotten, which I say I am not a doctor nor am I an expert, but I think that very likely this guilt, this sorrow, caused her cancer. Whatever the case, the tragic life that enveloped the Dahmer family is one that can never be erased from history, and especially from the history of the United States. The young woman was a 21-year-old student who was spending a few days off in Los Angeles at a hotel with a dark past. The last image of her alive was getting into an elevator, and it's really terrifying. Then she would vanish without leaving a single trace. And 19 days later, her body would be found naked inside a water tank on the roof of the building. This is a chilling case that to this day remains unsolved.
In today's video, I'm going to tell you a story that I believe is one of the most talked about and one that holds the most mysteries.
The case of Elisa Lam. It marks 1:31 in the morning on February 1st, 2013, when Elisa Lam, who was 21 years old at the time, quickly enters the elevator of the Cecil Hotel where she is staying in the city of Los Angeles. For her part, she's nervous, and this can be seen in her gestures. She bends down and touches the button panel looking closely. She has vision problems and does not have her glasses. She stands in the back corner of the elevator, waiting briefly. However, the elevator does not move. She steps forward, cautiously sticks her head out, looks around, and quickly steps back into the elevator. She presses her back against the wall of the elevator to avoid being seen, waits a bit, and nervously peeks out again. She gives a little hop at the elevator door and re-enters backwards, only to step out again and lean against the wall. Next to the open automatic door, only her black skirt is visible. She seems to be watching or waiting for something. Elisa in the hallway appears desperate, pursued. It looks like a real horror movie, but Elisa isn't acting for any film director. When she re-enters the elevator, she does so with her arms raised halfway as if in fear, and once again she obsessively presses the floor buttons. And nothing. The elevator not moving. She goes out once more, and standing in the hallway, she starts to make extremely strange movements with her hands. She moves them in a very particular way. I could almost say it's eerie. Elisa just evaporates at minute 2 with 28 seconds of the video. The elevator, despite Elisa's slaps at the buttons, has remained motionless. But time passes, and then the doors close and open on different floors. Elisa Lam would never be seen alive again. But, well, let me tell you a little about Elisa Lam's family and about her. Elisa Lam, whose original name is Lam Huji, was the daughter of a Chinese immigrant couple with depression issues, which is something very important. They had arrived in Vancouver, this in Canada, from Hong Kong, and opened a restaurant in North Burnaby to earn a living. After a complicated time of adaptation, they ended up settling down and got used to their new life. Elisa, on the other hand, was born there on April 30th of 91 and had a peaceful childhood. When she reached the age to pursue a career, she chose the University of British Columbia, and it was around that time that her parents noticed that her mood had changed, that she didn't seem happy, she didn't eat or sleep, and they consulted a specialist, and the diagnosis was bipolar disorder and depression. Despite this, she graduated in 2012. After she graduated, she seemed happy and had other plans. She wanted to move in with her friends, but before making that big change, she wanted to travel alone. She dreamed of visiting the United States, especially Los Angeles. Her parents were not entirely in agreement. They had some fears about her illness, which was quite reasonable. But she, on the other hand, didn't give them a choice and adjusted her vacation to her budget and embarked on the adventure. However, she did grant something to her parents. She would call home every day to report on how the trip was going. And so she did while she was alive. Now let's move on to January 26, 2013. Elisa arrived in Los Angeles, California after visiting San Diego. That same day, she checked into the Cecil Hotel, a building from the year 1924 with over 700 rooms. She had chosen it, enamored with its style and architecture. She stayed on the 9th floor and would only be there for a few days before heading further north to the city of Santa Cruz. The night she disappeared was the last she would spend in Los Angeles. On the afternoon of January 31st, hours before she disappeared, she bought books and records. The saleswoman gave her testimony to the investigators and said that she had seen her quite well within the normal, outgoing, kind, and cheerful, and that she was only worried about the weight of the books and how she was going to fit them in the luggage. On the other hand, the last photo Lisa took was in front of the mirror in her room's bathroom. Her face is not visible. She's wearing a black sweater with a little hat and holding a sky blue camera. This photo is strange in a way for a night that would always remain a total mystery. When Elisa's parents didn't hear from her on the 1st of February, they became alarmed.
I remind you that she had promised her parents that she would call them every day.
So after a few hours, they decided to call the police. 2 days later, they would land in Los Angeles to help in the search for their daughter. This search for Elisa Lam obviously started at the hotel, her room, the common areas, but the law does not allow for other people's rooms to be searched unless there is sufficient evidence to do so. So that was not done, and well, they found nothing. Her cell phone was also not found, and Elisa had not used it since the 31st day. On February 14th, when 2 weeks had already passed without news about the Canadian girl, the Los Angeles police released a truly chilling video from the hotel's security cameras. There, Elisa Lam was seen in one of the elevators acting strangely, and she is seen for 2 minutes and 28 seconds. The video quickly went viral in the United States, also in China, and everything is so mysterious that thousands of amateur detectives, so to speak, are ready to help solve the case on social media. Many talked about the dark history of the hotel, and in the first 10 days, the video was viewed by more than 3 million people with over 40,000 comments. So on the 19th, 10 days after the disappearance and 3 days after the video was published, Elisa is unfortunately found dead.
This, far from solving the mystery, opened up new unknowns.
The guests at the Hotel Savile had been complaining about the taste and color of the water that had been coming to the rooms for days. On the morning of February 19th, they were surprised because the water coming out of the bathroom pipes had no pressure, it was very dark, and had a horrible sweet taste. This is what the guests said.
The water tanks, on the other hand,
That supplied the hotel, which were 4 and were located on the roof of the building, that to get to them, several things were needed, which were keys to know the security codes that supposedly only the employees had, climb with large ladders and move heavy lids, this to look inside, and the technicians who were called to solve the water issue had to put special ladders and look inside. Then what they saw there was a swollen and greenish body in full state of decomposition that was floating inside. It was without clothes, and there were some belongings swimming around it. About its clothes, the truth is that no one agreed. And the versions that transpired contradicted each other. First, that it also floated inside the tank. Then that it had been left outside of it. And finally, that they were never found. The firefighters had to break a side of the tank to remove the body, and the police couldn't believe it. They had checked the terrace, but the dogs that detect the smell of bodies hadn't approached the water tanks. The autopsy found no signs of any aggression or physical abuse, and the toxicology tests also didn't find much. Traces of a medication that Lisa regularly consumed and a bit of alcohol. Forensic psychiatrists ruled out that this girl had taken her own life. But then the question was, what happened to Elisa Lam? No one had an answer. With this, let's now move on to the hotel. This place with a dark past. It is assumed that Elisa Lam was unaware of this horrible history of the building. It was founded in the 1920s in downtown Los Angeles. The hotel went through different periods. When the Great Depression hit 2 years after it was inaugurated, the owners decided that to survive, they had to rent the rooms long-term and at a low price. That's when dark and quite controversial characters appeared in its corridors. Between the 40s and 50s, the hotel became a place of people who give pleasure, who give passion, you know which ones I'm referring to, and illicit substances. The Jimenez became frequent, something every day in this place, and thus began to build an image of a cursed hotel. It was one of the last places where she was seen alive in 1947. Elizabeth Short, a 22-year-old girl who was brutally killed after leaving there, and her case became one of the most publicized unsolved crimes in the history of U.S. law enforcement. On the other hand, Richard Ramirez also stayed there, convicted of taking the lives of 14 women in Los Angeles, and he lived there between 1984 and 1985. He called himself a Satan's admirer and committed several of his crimes while living in the Cecil Hotel. They say that the number 14 was very significant to him. He paid $14 for each night. His room was on the 14th floor. He had taken the lives of 14 people, and taking advantage of this eerie fame of the place, another criminal of Austrian origin named Jack Underworth moved to the Cecil Hotel 6 years later. This man wanted to pay tribute to Ramirez and mingled with the Los Angeles police under the pretext of writing an article where he would compare the oldest job in the world, which you know which one I'm referring to, from Europe with that of the United States. However, Jack did not manage to surpass his sinister leader, but he did add to his list 12 lifeless people. But this was not the only thing. Not only were there crimes in the history of this building, but also repeated people who took their own lives. At 31, Norton poisoned himself in a room. At 54, Helen Gurney threw herself out of one of the windows. At 62, Julia Moore, after spending the night at the hotel, took her own life right there. 27-year-old Pauline Otten, after arguing with her husband, jumped out of the 9th floor window, which incidentally was the same floor where Elisa Lam was, and with the misfortune that when she fell, she also took the life of another person. Years later, Cowdy Osgood was found abused and lifeless in the hotel's switchboard room. To all these incidents, to call them something, we would have to add the cases of people who, while staying at this place, began to act strangely or had some episode of terror. There are dozens of such stories today. Despite the fact that the hotel was sold and they tried to change its reputation, tourism circuits usually include it in their trips because, well, you know that morbidity sells and attracts tourists. So just recently, in 2017, this place was voted as a cultural historical monument by the Los Angeles City Council. Now, moving on to the strange death of this girl, the Los Angeles Coroner's Office determined on February 21st, 2013 that Elisa's death had been the result of an accidental drowning due to a bipolar disorder. But that didn't answer one question. How did this girl get to this place? To begin with, they found no other camera in the place showing signs of her going towards her destination. On the other hand, it was determined that just that night, the rooftop door was open, but the alarm was connected. So if that had happened, it should have sounded, and even if it hadn't, the path was complex and complicated because the young woman would have had to climb the 3 meters high tank without clothes and with some personal items in hand. She would have had to open the heavy top lid of the tank and jump inside. From the inside, she wouldn't have been able to adjust the lid. The tanks, on the other hand, were not full. So, who could have adjusted it? Or as it was later said, could it be that the tank was uncovered that morning, allowing Lisa to get in without so many complications? Who knows what the truth is? But to this, we must add the fact that it was night and she had vision problems. The other hypothesis is that someone had taken her life, had taken her to the roof, climbed the tank with the body, and had opened the hatch to throw her in there. When the case became popular, there was also someone who uploaded a video to the internet showing that you could also access the terrace through one of the fire stairs, avoiding the alarms. It was also said that 2 of the 4 tanks were open that night. With the autopsy, there were some doubts. It was thought that as there was an accumulation of blood in the girl's anal area, this could be an indication of abuse, although it could also be due to the natural decomposition process of the body while her cell phone never appeared. However, her Tumblr prayer was updated several times. The question here was whether someone stole her cell phone or she had it programmed like that before she lost her life. The truth is, I don't know. But this is not all. There is still more. The video released by the police officers was missing a few seconds for the majority that was not really important. Nor did it prove anything, but there are also those who say that some employee of the place could have edited this video to avoid being discovered. The only certain thing about all this is that there are many hypotheses for such a mysterious death. Let me now tell you these mysterious conclusions that came out on the internet. The theories that emerged about this girl's behavior considered everything from her possibly having consumed some illegal substance to the existence of ghosts. Between conspiratorial conjectures and outlandish reasons, the truth is that we didn't stop with this case. There are those who think that the victim was tormented by the spirit of Richard Ramirez, whom I mentioned earlier. Others talk about the Korean elevator game, whose rules say that you have to go up alone and press several buttons in a certain order to reach an alternate dimension. There are also hypotheses that accuse the Canadian government because Lisa knew too much about a layer that would make people invisible, and that was going to be used for military purposes. Another version holds that Lisa never existed, that the government would have been experimenting with a tuberculosis outbreak called La Melissa, and that they invented the case to go viral and hide their failure. In fact, those urine tests called La Melissa do exist. But these are not the only explanations. There are also others who mention the similarity between Lisa's behavior in the elevator and the Dark Water movie. This is a Japanese suspense movie with water tanks, Oriental girl water, foul water, and an elevator. Somehow, many details of this case remind of this movie. Already in 2015, journalist Josh Dean, convinced that Lisa's life had been taken, was to the Hotel Cecil, but he didn't achieve anything that would reinforce his thesis. His conclusion was quite similar to the one the police had at that time. He believes that by escaping from a non-existent threat, she would have managed to get into the tank and couldn't get out of there. That's the only answer that makes sense, was what this journalist said. On the other hand, on February 10, Netflix is going to premiere a 4-episode documentary miniseries about this disappearance called Crime Scene: The Vanishing at the Cecil Hotel. Surely, as Netflix has a lot of money and also power, they will come to new conclusions. They will surely bring out new clues, new videos, and it would be quite good if they came to a different conclusion or the same one, but with good arguments, and that this case could be solved. Remember that on this Pepe Mystery channel, there are videos on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And also, if you want to have access to more content from this site, there is the members button, which costs about 50 Mexican pesos. You can instead have access to extra content. And as you will notice at the end of this video, your name will appear. Thank you.